Imagine being in Berlin 10 minutes after the wall fell. The world has already changed, but no one knows what to make of it. In 2026, artificial intelligence allows us to recreate those moments that don't appear in the history books. It's not about what happened. It's about the silence right after. Close your eyes for a second, because now you're going back to that moment. The wall had fallen, but Berlin did not immediately celebrate. 10 minutes later, what dominated the city was not the sound of freedom. It was silence. A strange, heavy, almost uncomfortable silence, as if the world had been shut down for a few moments to try to understand what had just happened. The streets were still there. The buildings were still standing. The streetlights lit up the cold night in the same way, but something invisible had broken, and no one knew exactly how to react to it. There was no collective explosion of joy. There were no screams. There was no unbridled running. Just people, standing there, looking at each other, as if they were waiting for some kind of authorization to feel. Soldiers remained motionless. Some still held their equipment, without any order to follow. Their faces expressed no anger, no victory, only confusion. For years they had been trained to watch that limit. Now the limit simply didn't exist anymore. And when a limit suddenly disappears, it's not freedom that comes first. It is emptiness. On one side, people watched the old wall as if it could still respond. On the other, families approached slowly, with short, cautious steps. No one ran. No one crossed with euphoria. It was like walking on something sacred, or too forbidden to be touched without fear. The concrete, once an absolute symbol of separation, was now cracked, open, injured, but still there. And maybe that's why the silence was so profound. Because the human brain takes longer to understand changes than the heart wants to accept. Some would put their hands on the cold surface of the wall just to make sure it was real. Others watched in silence, as if watching a dream for fear of waking up. There were people crying, not from joy but from exhaustion. Decades of living under an invisible division leave marks that do not disappear in 10 minutes. The air looked different, heavier, not by threat, but by expectation. Everyone felt that something huge had ended, but no one knew what was starting from there. There was no manual. There was no script. There was not a voice saying, "Now you are free." That was exactly the problem. Freedom came before explanation. In some parts of the city, the loudest sound was that of people's own breathing, the creaking of a shoe on the ground, the distant echo of a low conversation. The night was still cold, indifferent to the history being rewritten before her. At that time, Berlin did not seem like a city in celebration. It felt like a city on pause, as if you were holding your breath before the next beat. Because 10 minutes after the fall of the wall, what was felt was not victory. It was the unsettling feeling that the ancient world had died, but the new had not yet been born. And when the story enters this interval, between the end and the beginning, everything is silent, eerily silent. It was in this strange silence that something began to change, not abruptly, nor collectively. It changed slowly, almost shy. First a step, then another. People who had spent their entire lives separated by meters of concrete began to move in the same direction, without matching, without leadership, without words. Nobody said, "Let's go." But everyone seemed to feel that standing still no longer made sense. Some advanced only a few inches and stopped again. They looked around as if they were still waiting for someone to shout to come back. Others crossed the old boundary with their bodies tense, as if they were doing something wrong, even though they knew it was no longer forbidden. It was a simple gesture, walk, but their walking had historical weight. In the silent crowd, strangers stared at each other for seconds too long to be normal. There were no immediate smiles. There was recognition, a kind of human curiosity that cannot be explained. As if each face carried the same question, "Have you been through this too?" Some hands touched each other by chance, a mumbled apology, a timid nod, small gestures that would never appear in the official records. But that said more than any speech, because real reunification didn't start in governments. It started there, in the eyes of ordinary people trying to relearn how to get closer. At certain points, the wall was still physically present, broken, injured, but not entirely removed. Even so, it no longer fulfilled its function. People no longer saw it as a border. It had become a memory, and no one yet knew how to deal with it. There was contained joy, but there was also fear. Fear that everything was temporary. Fear that someone would show up saying that it had been a mistake. Fear that when he woke up the next day, everything would return to normal. Therefore, many remained there. They didn't want to leave. It was as if leaving meant missing that moment forever. Some people simply sat on the floor. Others remained standing, motionless, staring into space, trying to engrave that moment in their memory. And maybe this is where you, watching now, can feel something difficult to explain. Because imagine living a lifetime believing that the other side was unreachable, and, suddenly, realize that he has always been there, just a few steps away, separated only by decisions that never passed you by. At that moment, the story ceased to be collective and became intimate. Each person began to silently revisit their past. What would have been different? Who would have stayed? Who would have left? How many meetings have never happened because of a wall? It is impossible to cross such a threshold without taking questions with it. And maybe that's exactly why no one celebrated too loudly. Because when a barrier falls, it doesn't just free paths. It also frees memories. And not all of them are easy to face. If you were there, at that moment, would he have crossed immediately? Or would he have stood by and watched, afraid that it was too real to be true? This question, silent, still echoed among people, and it is precisely this that transforms that instant into something impossible to forget. As night began to fall, Berlin looked different, not because of the lights, but because of the way people walked. Nothing had changed physically immediately. The streets remained the same, the buildings the same, but the weather, this one was no longer the same. It is important to say something here. What you're hearing right now is a historical recreation, an attempt to reconstruct based on reports, records, and the human impact of that moment, how that first night may have felt. It is not a matter of stating every detail as an absolute fact, but of bringing you closer to the real atmosphere experienced by thousands of people who went through that moment without a manual, without warning, without emotional preparation. As the sky darkened, many began to leave, not because the moment had lost importance, but because the body could no longer take it. There was fatigue accumulated over years, not just physical, but emotional. Some people returned home in silence, holding on to what they had just experienced as if protecting something too fragile to be explained. Inside the apartments, few lights were turned on completely. The televisions on did not seem sufficient to explain what the eyes had seen. What he felt did not fit into words. It was like trying to sleep after a very strong shock. The body lies down, but the mind remains awake. In some homes, no one was able to have dinner. In others, families sat at the table without talking, not for lack of what to say, but for excess. There were too many questions hanging in the air. Questions about the next day, about the future, about waking up in a world that suddenly seemed bigger. Outside, the old wall still cast its shadow. Even broken, even crossed, it was still there, as a physical reminder that certain divisions don't disappear at the same pace as political decisions. The concrete remained, but for the first time, it no longer determined people's steps. Some returned to the site only to look once more before leaving. They didn't want that night to go by too quickly. They wanted to make sure that it wasn't a break, it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't a collective dream. And perhaps the strongest feeling of that night was not joy, but uncertainty. Freedom arrived without instructions, no prior notice, no promise that it would be easy. And that scares us, because when a structure falls, It takes with it everything that, even though it was unfair, offered predictability. The unknown can be liberating, but it also weighs. That night brought no answers. It only brought the awareness that nothing would ever be the same again. Berlin fell asleep differently, not in celebration, not in euphoria, but in silence, a new, deep silence, loaded with possibilities and fear at the same time. And maybe that's why this moment crossed generations, because sometimes history doesn't change with noise. It changes when everyone goes home, and they realize that the world that awaits them in the morning is no longer the same. This is not just the memory of a wall that fell. It is the portrait of a night when millions of people realized at the same time that the future had begun, even without anyone knowing exactly how to live inside it. Perhaps the most impressive thing was not the fall of the wall, but what did she provoke inside people that night? Because when a division disappears, it doesn't just free paths. It forces human beings to face everything that has been trapped for years.